When the HOA called 911 on me for walking near my own lake, they thought they had me trapped. But they didn't know I'd spent over a decade tracing titles, reading maps, and fighting boundary dispute. What they saw as an easy win would become a federal case that ended their entire reign of control. What began as a property argument would soon expose decades of fraud, intimidation, and one of the most shocking HOA scandals the county had ever seen. Before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story proves that sometimes the quietest homeowner can become the loudest voice for justice. The first time Quincy Dalton saw the lake, it was quiet, too quiet. The surface sat still as if the water was holding its breath. He'd spent months searching for the right piece of land, something peaceful, secluded, and untangled by years of HOA bureaucracy. What he found instead was a secret buried beneath cattails and decades of paperwork. 2 acres, a small cabin plot, and an 8-acre lake wrapped in reeds and fog. The listing had sat unsold for over a year. Locals whispered about how the HOA across the road had once managed the lake, but no one could explain how or why. For Quincy, who spent 11 years as a land surveyor and title examiner, those were exactly the kinds of mysteries he enjoyed solving. He closed on the property with meticulous precision. The deed was clean. The title insurance confirmed no easements, no encumbrances, and no covenant restrictions. The lake, as recorded, was entirely within his boundary line. To him, this wasn't just land, it was closure, the kind of peace his late mother used to talk about. She'd always said that property was the one thing people could build a life around if they knew how to defend it. On his first morning there, fog hovered low over the water as he set up his surveying tripod. Birds skimmed the surface, scattering reflections of the rising sun. That's when the sound of approaching footsteps cracked the silence, 3 of them, synchronized, deliberate. A woman in her 50s led the group. Her stride was sharp and her presence even sharper, the kind of person who carried authority like a weapon. 2 men followed, one holding a thick binder, the other carrying nothing but suspicion. The woman introduced herself briskly as Margot Sinclair, president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. She pointed at the lake as though claiming ownership through posture alone. Quincy kept calm as she declared the lake community property. She spoke of HOA regulations, maintenance dues, and water access rules. Every word sounded rehearsed, the echo of authority repeated so often it had become truth in their minds. He didn't argue. He simply showed her the recorded deed with the county seal. The lake sat entirely within his property. No HOA jurisdiction. No legal tie. The men behind her exchanged uncertain glances, but Margot's expression didn't waver. Her certainty came not from law, but from years of unchallenged control. Within hours, the harassment began. By late morning, the police arrived, the first of 3 visits that day. Each officer came responding to the same complaint: trespassing on HOA property. Quincy stood on his own land holding his documents while red and blue lights reflected across the water. The first officer was polite, the second indifferent, and the third simply exhausted by the déjà vu of it all. By the end of the day, Quincy had timestamps, badge numbers, dispatch records, and enough photographs to prove a pattern. Not confusion, but targeted intimidation. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a strategy. He recognized it instantly. Margot and her board weren't just mistaken, they were running something deeper. An illusion of control propped up by threats, half-truths, and years of homeowners too weary to fight back. Quincy had seen it before, but this time, he was the one standing on the boundary line. That night, sitting on the tailgate of his truck, he watched the moon ripple on the dark surface of the lake. It was still beautiful, still his, but now it carried weight, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. Somewhere under that water, he suspected, was the answer. Something built decades ago. Something the HOA didn't want him to find. He opened his laptop, searching through county archives and federal records, and what he found made his pulse quicken. The lake wasn't just a pond. It was connected, a man-made culvert system from the 1940s linking it directly to Sweetwater Creek, a navigable river under federal waterway jurisdiction. If that connection still existed, then the HOA's authority here wasn't just false, it was illegal. He saved the documents, backed them up to cloud storage, and printed 3 hard copies. He knew what came next: confrontation, denial, and escalation. But he also knew the truth was now measurable, mapped in coordinates, time-stamped, and impossible to erase. As the night wind skimmed the lake's surface, Quincy understood something his mother had once told him long ago: land keeps its secrets for those patient enough to look. By morning, he'd start digging, literally. He had no idea that by the end of the week, his quiet lake would become a federal investigation site, and the HOA that had run unchecked for 20 years would be standing on the edge of collapse. At dawn, a pale mist floated over the lake, soft as smoke. The reeds whispered with the movement of small creatures, and somewhere under the stillness, the faint sound of running water pulsed, a reminder that this lake was alive in ways no one else realized. Quincy Dalton pulled on his chest waders and stepped carefully into the shallows. The water was cold, opaque, and heavy with decades of neglect. He was searching for proof, not speculation, not rumor, but physical evidence of the connection he'd uncovered in the archives the night before. His hands tightened around the steel soil probe as he sank it into the muck. Inch by inch, he pressed deeper, the rod sliding through layers of silt and decay until it hit something solid. A hollow thud echoed beneath the surface. Concrete. Quincy cleared away mud with his hands until a round structure began to take shape. A concrete pipe roughly 3 feet in diameter, angled downward into the earth. A slow current pulsed through it, faint but undeniable. Water flowed into the pipe and vanished beneath the lakebed, heading east, toward the woods, toward Sweetwater Creek. The connection was real. He photographed every angle, embedding GPS data in each image. The coordinates matched exactly with the historical map he'd found, the 1947 Army Corps of Engineers dredging permit that described a culvert installed between the mill pond and the creek. It wasn't just history, it was jurisdiction. Back on shore, Quincy opened his laptop on the tailgate of his truck and cross-referenced the regulation. Title 33, Section 329.4 of the Code of Federal Regulations. It defined waters of the United States as any water body physically connected to a navigable channel, whether on private or public land. The moment he saw that clause, the conclusion was clear. This lake, his lake, fell under federal jurisdiction. The implications rolled through his mind like distant thunder. It meant the HOA had no legal authority to regulate, restrict, or collect money for this waterway. It also meant that if they'd been dumping chemicals, fertilizers, or debris into it for years, they might have violated the Clean Water Act. Quincy's hands trembled as he printed the regulation text and the historical permit. Every document told the same story. The HOA's authority here had never existed. He spent the next 2 days assembling what he would later call the evidence binder. 6 tabs of precision, each one a trap waiting to spring. The first contained photographs and diagrams of the culvert. The second held historical maps and the 1952 permit that proved federal recognition. The third outlined the law itself, complete with a plain-language summary and flowchart tracing federal oversight. The fourth included his deed, survey, and title insurance. The fifth covered the HOA's own bylaws, highlighting every omission about the lake. And the sixth, perhaps the most damning, was an incident log, timestamps of police calls, badge numbers, email threats, and correspondence from Margot Sinclair. When it was complete, he made 3 identical copies. One for himself, one for safekeeping at the bank, and one uploaded to cloud storage under encrypted access. By the time he finished, the sun had dipped below the trees, and the lake reflected the pink haze of evening. It looked peaceful, deceptively so. But in that still reflection, Quincy saw the beginning of something much larger. 2 days later, he received a reply from the HOA. Margot's email was short, stiff, and formal. "We request your attendance at a board meeting to discuss the lake's jurisdictional concerns. Tuesday, 7 p.m. at the Meadowbrook Community Center." It wasn't a request. It was a summons. The community center sat at the edge of the subdivision, a boxy building of vinyl siding and fluorescent lighting. Quincy arrived early, binder in hand. 5 people sat behind a folding table, Margot in the center, flanked by the treasurer, Philip, and the ever-watchful Clayton. The others stared at him with wary curiosity. Margot's smile was the kind politicians wore when cameras were rolling. She spoke of community traditions, lake management, and shared asset. Quincy listened in silence before setting his binder on the table and opening to the first page. He explained, without emotion, that the lake was connected to a navigable waterway, placing it under federal oversight. He presented the 1952 permit, the regulation text, the maps, and his deed. Then he showed them the HOA covenants, page by page, 38 in total, with not one mention of a lake. Philip leaned forward, his brow furrowing. Margot didn't blink. For 20 years, she had operated with total control, and now the foundation beneath her authority was dissolving. Her lips tightened as he spoke, her eyes flicking toward Clayton whenever the evidence became too irrefutable. Finally, when Quincy finished, she straightened her posture and said, "We've maintained that lake for decades. We've collected fees and paid for landscaping, insurance, and maintenance." Quincy simply closed the binder and replied that he'd be happy to review those records. The silence that followed was suffocating. Philip shifted in his seat. Clayton looked ready to argue, but Margot stopped him with a hand gesture. Her face was pale but her voice steady, a mask of control that was cracking around the edges. When Quincy left the meeting, he knew one thing for certain: Margot Sinclair wasn't finished. People like her didn't retreat quietly. They regrouped, retaliated, and rewrote the story to preserve their power. 2 nights later, the first anonymous email arrived. Subject line: "You should know what's really going on." It came from a woman named Beatrice Navarro, a resident of the subdivision for over 2 decades. Her message was short. She'd seen what was happening and had information about how the HOA first took control of the lake. She wanted to meet privately. They met at a coffee shop outside town. Beatrice was cautious, her eyes scanning the room before sitting down. Her voice shook at first, but the more she spoke, the more her anger surfaced. She told Quincy about an elderly man named Harper, the original owner of the lake, who had died in 2003. After his death, Margot, newly elected HOA president at the time, had proposed that the association manage the lake as a community amenity. There had been no legal transfer, no sale, no county filing. Just a vote at a board meeting attended by a handful of homeowners. From that day forward, the HOA began collecting annual lake maintenance fees, $120 from every household, year after year. 2 decades of payments had added up to over $400,000. And no one had ever seen a single audited financial record. Beatrice handed him a folder, photocopied minutes from the 2003 meeting. One line stood out: "Motion to assume management of Community Lake, approved unanimously." No documentation, no authority. Just words. She showed him a handwritten list of 12 homeowners who had questioned the fees over the years. People who'd been fined, threatened, or harassed into silence. Some had moved away. Others had simply given up. Quincy photographed every page, thanking her for her courage. She nodded solemnly and said one sentence that would stay with him: "We all knew something was wrong. We just needed someone who knew how to prove it." Back at the lake, Quincy stood under the fading light and looked out across the water. The calm surface reflected the treeline perfectly, half reality, half mirror. Beneath that calm, the truth was stirring. He knew now that this wasn't about trespassing or property lines or even the culvert beneath the mud. It was about power, who claimed it, who abused it, and who finally stripped it away. In his truck, he drafted a new plan. The HOA bylaws contained a clause he had noticed earlier. If 10% of members signed a petition citing matters of community concern, the board was legally required to call a special meeting open to all residents. That would be his next move. He'd use their own rules to force the truth into the open. The storm had officially begun. The following week moved like a storm brewing over still water. Every day felt charged with the weight of what was coming. Quincy spent long hours at his desk, assembling the next phase of his case, not for lawyers or courts this time, but for the residents who had been quietly paying for something they didn't own. He drafted a one-page petition titled Request for Special Meeting, Lake Jurisdiction and Financial Transparency. It was brief, factual, and carried the weight of precision. The bylaw clause was clear. Only 10% of homeowners needed to sign for the board to be legally obligated to hold a meeting. He met with Beatrice Navarro again, who helped circulate the petition quietly through the neighborhood. She knocked on doors, spoke in whispers over fences, and reminded neighbors of the years of unexplained fees. Some hesitated, afraid of retaliation from Margot. Others signed without question, their signatures trembling with anger and relief. Within 4 days they had 22 signatures, more than enough. Quincy mailed the petition to the HOA via certified mail. There was no turning back now. 3 days later, Margot's official notice went out to all residents. The HOA would hold a special meeting to address concerns regarding lake jurisdiction and fiscal management on Thursday, 7 p.m., at the Meadowbrook Community Center. The language was sterile, but beneath it lay panic. Quincy knew Margot would be preparing her own defense. He suspected she'd rely on intimidation, emotional manipulation, or half-truths to preserve control. But what she didn't have was documentation, and in battles like this, paper always won over personality. Thursday evening came with heavy clouds that matched the mood of the neighborhood. The parking lot outside the community center overflowed with cars. Streetlights reflected off rain puddles as residents walked toward the building in clusters, some angry, some anxious, all curious. Inside, the air was warm and electric. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the HOA board sat like a tribunal. Margot was in the middle, perfectly composed, her blonde hair pinned tight, hands clasped around a manila folder. On either side, Philip the treasurer, Clayton, and 2 other board members shifted uncomfortably under the fluorescent lights. Quincy set up a projector at the back of the room and loaded his presentation, 15 slides of facts, maps, and evidence. He had practiced every word until his voice no longer shook when he spoke them aloud. At exactly 7 o'clock, Margot called the meeting to order. Her voice carried the practiced confidence of someone used to being obeyed. She welcomed everyone, then, without a smile, gestured to Quincy. "Since Mr. Dalton has raised these concerns, we'll begin by allowing him to present his findings." Every eye in the room turned toward him. Quincy walked to the front, his binder under one arm, and faced the crowd. He began with history. The origins of the lake, the 1947 dredging, the 1952 Army Corps of Engineers permit. Then he explained the law, how any body of water connected to a navigable river fell under federal jurisdiction. He showed the topographic maps, the photos of the culvert, the section of federal code highlighted in yellow. Slide after slide, he peeled away the narrative the HOA had built. The lake wasn't community property. It was private land, federally regulated. Then came the money. He revealed the math, 180 households paying $120 per year for 2 decades. Over $430,000 collected in lake maintenance fees. The room began to stir as whispers spread like ripples across the surface of still water. He turned to Margot. "Can the board provide itemized documentation of how these funds were used?" Her voice was smooth but brittle. "Those records are managed by the board and not available for public inspection without formal request." He didn't raise his voice. Then consider this a formal request, on behalf of the 22 members who signed the petition. A few homeowners clapped softly. Others murmured in agreement. Philip shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His face had gone pale. "Margot, I've asked to review those records before," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying. "I've never seen a separate policy or a breakdown of the expenses. We should have documentation." Margot's composure cracked slightly. "This is not the place for internal board discussion," she snapped. But it was too late. The room was fully awake now. Quincy clicked to the next slide. A scanned copy of the HOA's official plat map with bright red lines marking its jurisdiction boundaries. His property sat clearly outside them, shaded in blue. The separation was unmistakable. He explained calmly that the HOA's claim over the lake was unsupported by any legal document or recorded transfer of ownership. The meeting minutes from 2003, which Beatrice had provided, showed nothing more than a self-appointed motion to assume management. The murmurs became louder, voices rising with disbelief and anger. A man in the back row stood up, his voice cracking. "So you're telling us we've been paying for something we never owned?" A woman near the front added, "That's theft. We should have been told years ago." Margot's face flushed crimson. She tried to regain control, her voice sharp, desperate. "This meeting is getting out of hand. None of you understand the complexity of HOA governance. We've done what's best for the community." Quincy stayed steady. "What's best for the community," he said evenly, "is transparency." The room erupted in agreement. Philip took a slow breath, then spoke again, this time louder. "I move that we request an independent audit of all lake maintenance funds collected over the past 20 years. A younger woman near the back raised her hand. "I second that motion." The words landed like a gavel. Margot froze, realizing her authority was slipping away in real time. "An audit is unnecessary and costly," she protested. But the crowd was already responding. Dozens of hands rose, waving in favor of the motion. Quincy counted silently, more than 2/3 of the room. Margot slammed her folder shut and declared the meeting adjourned, but her voice trembled. She stood abruptly, gathering her papers as Clayton followed, glaring at Quincy as they walked out. The door closed behind them with a thud that echoed in the silence they left behind. Philip remained seated, shoulders slumped, the weight of years pressing down on him. For the first time, the residents saw not a treasurer complicit in corruption, but a man who had been just as controlled as they had. Quincy turned off the projector. The tension in the room began to unravel into conversation. People clustered around him, asking questions, thanking him, wanting to know what came next. Beatrice stood near the exit, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. Outside, the air was cool, the pavement still wet from the earlier drizzle. The night smelled like wet leaves and change. For the first time in 2 decades, the residents of Meadowbrook had seen what had been hidden behind the facade of authority. Quincy sat in his truck for a long moment before starting the engine. He didn't feel victory, not yet. He felt anticipation, the heavy calm that settles before the second wave of a storm. He knew Margot wouldn't accept defeat quietly. When he returned to the lake the next morning, the gate at the entrance of his property hung open. The heavy chain he had locked through it was cut cleanly in half, lying on the gravel like a snake split in two. He photographed everything: the gate, the broken lock, the red spray-painted words scrawled across his private property sign, "Thief." For a brief moment, standing in the gray light of dawn, he wondered how far Margot and her loyalists were willing to go to reclaim control. But then the fear burned away, replaced by focus. He had documentation. He had law. And now, he had the community watching. He would turn every act of intimidation into evidence, every threat into a record. The storm wasn't ending, it was evolving. The night after the community meeting, a steady drizzle misted across the lake, turning the dirt road into a ribbon of silver under his headlights. Quincy parked near the shoreline, still thinking about the raised voices and the shifting faces in the crowd. For the first time, the community had seen Margot's mask crack. He had expected pushback, but not silence, and that was exactly what worried him. Silence from people like Margot was never surrender. It was plotting. By morning, the signs appeared. The gate at the entrance to his property had been cut again, the metal chain severed cleanly in the middle. The lock was missing, and the gate swung freely in the cool wind. A red spray paint slash marked his private property sign. Beneath it, someone had scrawled "thief" in uneven letters. The scratch on his truck came next. A deliberate gouge that ran from the front fender to the rear quarter panel, one long, jagged scar deep enough to cut through paint and primer. Quincy took photographs from multiple angles, embedding timestamps and GPS coordinates into each image. Then he called the sheriff's non-emergency line. The deputy who arrived was young but professional, her notepad balanced on one palm while she surveyed the damage. She asked the obvious question, "Anyone you suspect?" He answered carefully. He explained the HOA dispute, the meeting, the names, the tension. She wrote everything down without comment, but her eyes lingered on the spray-painted sign. When she finished the report, she advised him to install security cameras. "Sometimes," she said, "the best evidence is the kind people don't know they're giving you." That afternoon, he drove to town and returned with 4 motion-activated cameras, each one capable of uploading footage directly to a secure cloud server. By sunset, he had mounted them in strategic positions: the gate, the sign, his truck, and the shoreline. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe. He knew Margot's anger, and he knew she'd want to reassert control. But this time, every move she made would leave a digital footprint. At 11:43 that night, his phone vibrated. The app linked to his cameras had detected movement at the gate. Quincy opened the feed. The image was grainy in the darkness, but clear enough: a white pickup truck rolling slowly past the entrance. It paused, engine idling. Then the driver's door opened. Clayton stepped out. The light caught his face for an instant as he scanned the property, then walked toward the sign before turning back. He never crossed the boundary, but the message was unmistakable: intimidation wrapped in plausible deniability. Quincy saved the footage, labeled it, and added it to a new folder on his laptop titled Harassment Documentation. He included the police report, the photos, the timestamps, and now, video evidence. Then he sent everything in an email to the county sheriff's office. He didn't wait for a response. He knew how systems worked: slow, procedural, and deliberate. So he moved faster. The next morning, 2 new emails went out, one to the Army Corps of Engineers and another to the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. Each contained the same message. He explained that he owned a property containing a lake connected to a navigable waterway by a culvert installed in 1947. He outlined that a local homeowners association was asserting regulatory control without legal standing, that harassment and property damage had occurred, and that he was requesting formal jurisdictional confirmation and federal guidance. He attached every document: the maps, the regulations, the permit, and photograph. Then he hit send. Within minutes, automated replies arrived. The Corps estimated 15 business days for a review. The EPA gave a similar window. He closed his laptop and looked toward the water. The reflection of the morning sun shimmered across its surface like fractured glass. The next 10 days were a blur of waiting. He worked from home, monitoring the camera feeds, documenting every unusual sound or vehicle near the property. Margot's silence continued, but small signs of her influence surfaced: anonymous letters in his mailbox, tire tracks near his driveway, and neighbors who once waved now looking away. He spent those days studying patterns, both on his property and in the HOA's communications. Their website still listed the lake as community property, complete with a gallery of residents fishing along the shore, images likely taken years ago. He printed screenshots and archived them as evidence. Then, on the 11th day, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number with an Atlanta area code. "Mr. Dalton, this is Delia Brennan from the Army Corps of Engineers, Atlanta Regulatory Division," the voice said, calm and efficient. "I'm calling regarding your jurisdictional determination request." She confirmed what he already suspected, but hearing it aloud sent a rush of validation through him. "The lake on your property falls under waters of the United States due to its connection to Sweetwater Creek," she said. "We will be issuing a cease and desist letter to the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association within 48 hours, informing them that they possess no regulatory authority over the water body." Quincy stood frozen, the words sinking in. He had won the first major battle. Delia continued, explaining that they would also open a compliance review to determine whether any unpermitted activities had occurred. If the HOA had discharged chemicals or altered the water without authorization, that could trigger Clean Water Act violations. They would need to inspect the site soon. He confirmed his availability, provided directions, and ended the call. The sense of relief was tempered with understanding. This was only the beginning. Federal oversight moved slowly, but once it started, it didn't stop. 2 days later, another call came, this time from the county attorney's office. The clerk spoke briskly, reading from prepared note. The county had received multiple homeowner complaints demanding a financial audit of the HOA. In response, the board was being ordered to provide 5 years of detailed financial records, including itemized expenditures related to the lake and proof of liability insurance. They had 30 days to comply. Margot's empire was beginning to crumble. That night, the air around the lake felt different. Crickets droned from the reeds, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Quincy sat on the tailgate of his truck, watching the reflection of the moon dance across the black surface. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a quiet smile. He knew Margot would hear about the federal letter soon. He imagined her reaction, the disbelief, the denial, the eventual rage. He could almost picture her pacing across her pristine living room, rehearsing the speech she'd give to the board about government overreach and misinterpretation. But the paper trail didn't care about her outrage. It spoke louder than her voice ever could. Still, he stayed cautious. The next move from people like her was rarely verbal. It was calculated, emotional, and personal. His cameras caught more vehicles passing by that week. Cars that slowed, headlights dimmed, as if checking whether he was watching. He saved every frame. Each one became another brick in his wall of evidence. When the letter from the Army Corps arrived, its language was dry, bureaucratic, and devastating. It confirmed federal jurisdiction and ordered the HOA to immediately cease all management activities related to the lake. Copies were sent to both Margot and the county. Less than 48 hours later, word spread through the neighborhood that Margot had called an emergency board session. Residents were seen entering her home late in the evening, lights blazing through her bay windows until after midnight. No one knew what was discussed, but the next morning 2 of the board members resigned. Clayton didn't. At dawn, one of Quincy's cameras recorded his white pickup again, slowing near the gate. This time, he didn't stop. He tossed something from his window, an envelope that landed in the gravel. Quincy approached cautiously after the truck disappeared. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with 5 words written in red marker. "You don't belong here." He didn't flinch. He placed the note inside a plastic sleeve, photographed it, and added it to the growing file of evidence. By then, the machinery of accountability had already begun turning, slow, relentless, unstoppable. He knew Margot's silence would break soon. When it did, it wouldn't be words, it would be exposure. The storm he had predicted was no longer coming. It was already here, circling the lake like thunder that refused to fade. The morning the federal inspectors arrived, the lake was glassy and silent, its surface still as a photograph. Fog hung low, rolling off the water in pale ribbons, muting the world in shades of gray. Quincy stood near the shore, binder tucked under one arm, as two white SUVs approached slowly down the gravel road. Their license plates bore the seals of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency. The first woman who stepped out introduced herself as Delia Brennan, the same voice that had called him days earlier. She wore a reflective vest and carried a clipboard heavy with forms. Behind her came Agent Morales, an EPA field investigator, his calm demeanor revealing years of experience handling environmental disputes like this one. Without much ceremony, they began their inspection. Delia moved along the shoreline, marking coordinates on her GPS tablet, while Morales unpacked equipment from a black case, sampling bottles, depth sensors, and a portable turbidity meter. Quincy followed quietly, answering questions when asked, keeping his words precise and factual. Delia crouched by the water's edge, running her fingers across a patch of dark sediment. It smeared across her gloves like grease. "You said the HOA's landscapers used fertilizer near here?" she asked, noting the location. He nodded. "Every spring, they dump bags of it along the bank. I found receipts in one of the maintenance logs a resident forwarded to me." Morales tested the sample, watching the readings climb on his device. "That explains the algae bloom we're seeing," he murmured. "Phosphates off the charts." They moved methodically, documenting everything: the broken culvert, the unnatural erosion lines, the faint chemical sheen along the southern edge. Delia photographed the area where Quincy had uncovered the concrete pipe. She traced its direction on her map, following it through the cattails and into the woods, where it disappeared beneath a bed of roots. "This line runs straight to Sweetwater Creek," she said finally. "That means every chemical dumped here flows directly into a federally regulated waterway." Her tone was calm, but Quincy could hear the weight behind it. Violations of the Clean Water Act were no small matter. Civil penalties could reach tens of thousands of dollars per day of discharge. He watched as they sealed the sample bottles and labeled them with precise timestamp. Then Delia turned to him. "We'll file a jurisdictional report this week," she said. "If the HOA's been managing or altering this water without a federal permit, they'll have to explain themselves." Quincy felt a quiet satisfaction rise in his chest, not triumph, but vindication. For weeks, Margot and her allies had called him a trespasser, a liar, even a thief. Now, the evidence was shifting out of their control and into the hands of law. That afternoon, Delia and Morales drove across the road into the Meadowbrook subdivision. Quincy watched from a distance as they parked near the HOA's office, a converted two-car garage attached to Margot's home. Residents gathered on sidewalks, whispering, their phones held discreetly at their sides. Margot came out to meet them, immaculate as always in her pressed blouse and pearl earrings, her expression a portrait of restrained indignation. She shook Delia's hand stiffly, then led the agents inside. For over an hour, the doors stayed closed. From his vantage point near the lake, Quincy could only imagine the conversation unfolding inside. Legal definitions clashing with denial, years of authority colliding with the unyielding language of federal code. When the agents finally emerged, Margot followed them to the curb, her face pale and tight. Her voice carried faintly across the distance, sharp but controlled. Delia responded evenly, gesturing toward the lake. It was clear from her tone that no amount of local posturing could rewrite federal jurisdiction. The following morning, the first official notice appeared, taped neatly to the HOA's announcement board. It was a cease and desist order issued jointly by the Army Corps and EPA. The document required immediate suspension of all activities related to the lake, including landscaping, water treatments, and fee collection pending further investigation. By noon, the entire neighborhood knew. Within 24 hours, emails, text threads, and social media posts ignited across the Meadowbrook community. Residents shared copies of the notice, debated its meaning, and demanded answers. Some were furious at the revelation, others humiliated that they had been deceived for so long. For Margot, the fallout was immediate. The HOA's treasurer, Philip, resigned officially, citing ethical conflicts. The vice president, a man named Hartwell, posted a public statement distancing himself from all financial decisions regarding the lake. The HOA's official website quietly removed every mention of it from their property listings. But Margot herself remained silent. That silence, Quincy knew, was not surrender, it was calculation. 3 days later, it broke. A typed letter arrived at his mailbox, printed on the HOA's official stationery, bearing Margot's unmistakable signature. It accused him of malicious interference with community operations and defamation of board officers. She demanded that he cease harassment and return access to the community lake or face civil action. He read it twice, then filed it neatly into a folder labeled retaliation attempts. That evening, Delia called again. "We've reviewed the HOA's maintenance records," she said. "They've been applying herbicides and fertilizers without any environmental compliance documentation. There are also financial inconsistencies, funds withdrawn for maintenance contracts paid to non-existent vendors." She paused, letting the words settle. "We're referring this to the county district attorney's office. There may be grounds for criminal investigation." Quincy didn't reply at first. He stared at the lake, the reflection of the setting sun burning across its surface like molten glass. For the first time, he felt the full gravity of what had begun. A simple boundary dispute had become a federal case, a community scandal, and a reckoning decades in the making. The next morning, federal vehicles returned. This time, they weren't alone. A county sheriff's car followed behind, its lights flashing lazily in the mist. Agents and deputies carried sealed boxes out of the HOA office, computers, binders, folders labeled Lake Fund. Residents gathered on porches and driveways, watching in stunned silence. Some recorded videos, others whispered prayers of gratitude or disbelief. Margot stood at her doorway, arms folded tightly, her expression unreadable. But her eyes were no longer defiant, they were hollow. She knew the illusion was gone. By evening, local news vans appeared at the subdivision entrance. Reporters set up cameras, narrating live as footage of the lake played in the background. Headlines spread online. Federal agencies investigate HOA over illegal lake control, homeowners demand restitution after 2 decades of false fees. Quincy's phone buzzed nonstop with calls from journalists and neighbors, but he refused to give statements. He didn't need to. The facts were speaking louder than anything he could say. That night, sitting by the water's edge, Quincy felt the first true sense of calm since he'd moved there. The wind rustled through the reeds, and the moon reflected pure and unbroken on the surface. The lake was finally what it was always meant to be, free from control, untethered by greed, no longer a weapon of manipulation. But peace came with an echo. The echo of what would come next. Investigations had begun, but accountability was still miles away. He knew Margot wouldn't disappear quietly. Her type never did. They found ways to twist stories, to shift blame, to play the victim when the walls closed in. Somewhere deep down, he suspected she wasn't done. And he was right. 3 nights later, one of his cameras caught movement again, this time not at the gate but near the shoreline. A faint silhouette waded into the shallows under moonlight, stopping where the culvert disappeared beneath the water. The figure bent down, dropped something, and turned away. By the time Quincy reached the spot, the intruder was gone. Floating near the culvert's mouth was a small black plastic bag, half submerged, leaking a trail of iridescent liquid into the water. He stared at it for a long moment, then backed away carefully and called Delia. Her voice was calm, but her words cut through the night. "Don't touch it. We're on our way." The investigation wasn't over. It had just become criminal. When dawn broke the next morning, the lake no longer looked peaceful. The fog hung thick and low, rolling across the surface like smoke from a hidden fire. Quincy stood on the shore, wrapped in a heavy jacket, watching as federal agents and county deputies moved methodically through his property. The discovery from the night before, a leaking plastic bag near the culvert, had turned the quiet lake into a sealed investigation site. The faint chemical odor lingered in the air, sharp and bitter. Delia Brennan from the Army Corps returned, her expression grim as she directed 2 EPA technicians collecting water samples. They wore rubber gloves up to their elbows and sealed each container in evidence bags. A small white tent had been set up near the shoreline, and a drone hovered above, capturing aerial footage for contamination mapping. Agent Morales arrived soon after, clipboard in hand. "It's some sort of solvent," he explained, his tone clipped and professional. "We won't know the exact compound until the lab results come in, but it's definitely synthetic and recent. Whatever was in that bag wasn't here long." Delia nodded, scanning the lake's far side where the mist was lifting. "They were trying to destroy the evidence," she said quietly. "Maybe to contaminate it, make it harder to prove the water was ever clean." Quincy didn't reply. He felt the exhaustion of weeks weighing down his bones. It had started as a property boundary issue, a simple question of ownership, and now he was standing in the middle of a federal contamination investigation. He turned his gaze toward the opposite bank where Meadowbrook's neatly trimmed lawns met the treeline. The houses looked calm, ordinary, almost innocent. But behind those closed windows, the HOA's empire was collapsing. By midday, the agents packed up, sealing the samples in coolers for transport. Delia approached Quincy with a clipboard. "We'll keep you updated on lab results," she said. "If this solvent matches anything from the HOA's supply inventory, it becomes criminal tampering." Quincy signed the form she handed him, acknowledging the collection process. She studied him for a moment before adding, "You've been patient through all this. Most people would have walked away weeks ago." He gave a faint, tired smile. "Walking away is what people like Margot count on." Delia nodded. "Well, that's not going to happen here. Not anymore." That evening, the county sheriff held a short press briefing near the subdivision entrance. Reporters gathered under the glow of floodlights as microphones captured every word. The sheriff confirmed an ongoing investigation into possible environmental tampering and financial impropriety by the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. He didn't name Margot directly, but everyone understood who he meant. Back inside the subdivision, the tension was tangible. Neighbors who had once followed her leadership now avoided eye contact when she walked by. Her car sat idle in the driveway most days, curtains drawn, porch light off even after dark. By the end of the week, the news broke publicly. Local headlines spread fast. Federal probe links HOA to illegal dumping in protected lake. County investigators examine $400,000 in missing HOA funds. Social media carried the story further. Former residents from across the state shared their experiences with the Meadowbrook Board, unexplained fines, sudden maintenance fees, intimidation letters. The HOA had ruled through fear and silence for decades. Now, fear had changed sides. 3 days later, a county environmental officer arrived at Quincy's door with lab results in hand. The solvent recovered from the culvert was identified as glyphosate-based herbicide concentrate, typically used in large-scale landscaping. In concentrated form, it was toxic to fish, birds, and small mammals, and strictly regulated near federal waterways. The bottle recovered from the bag had been traced back to a local supplier under a corporate account. The name listed, Meadowbrook Property Association. The officer left him a copy of the report, and by that evening, county deputies arrived at Margot's home with a search warrant. The once pristine house, with its manicured shrubs and pale shutters, became a scene of flashing lights and murmured disbelief. Residents watched from the sidewalks as boxes were carried out, files sealed in plastic evidence containers. Margot stood on her front porch as officers led her down the steps, wrists cuffed loosely in front of her. Her composure, once ironclad, had fractured entirely. The cameras caught the moment. The HOA president who had ruled over every detail of the community now surrounded by police under a darkening sky. She didn't speak, didn't look at anyone. The neighborhood fell silent except for the mechanical clicking of cameras and the rustle of rain in the trees. For Quincy, the arrest didn't bring joy, only a deep, quiet relief. He sat on his porch that night, staring across the lake. The surface reflected nothing now, only darkness. The rain thickened, drumming softly on the metal roof, blurring the world into sound and shadow. The following week, investigators pieced together the final picture. The HOA had collected maintenance fees for years under the pretense of lake care, diverting the money into a private account controlled by Margot and Clayton. Landscaping records showed inflated costs, false invoices, and shell companies created to funnel payment. More disturbing were the environmental findings. Over a 5-year period, the HOA had routinely dumped leftover herbicides and pesticides into the water rather than pay for proper disposal. Residents had unknowingly been swimming and fishing in contaminated water. The EPA's report was blunt. Evidence suggests deliberate disposal of hazardous chemicals in violation of the Clean Water Act. Estimated contamination period, 2016 to 2024. Cleanup crews arrived soon after. Flat-bottomed boats with suction pumps, booms to contain surface runoff, and environmental contractors in white hazmat suit. 4 days, the air smelled faintly of chemicals as they drained sections of the lake to remove sediment. The once serene water became a controlled site of restoration, marked with caution tape and floating barriers. Neighbors came out to watch quietly. Some wept. Others apologized to Quincy in hushed voices, thanking him for refusing to give up. He accepted their words politely, though part of him still struggled to believe it was over. By late spring, the headlines faded. Margot Sinclair was charged with environmental tampering, wire fraud, and misappropriation of funds. Clayton faced charges of aiding and abetting. The HOA was placed under state receivership pending dissolution. Quincy's lake, though scarred, was healing. The water slowly cleared. The fish returned. Federal crews removed the final barriers and handed him a certificate confirming compliance and cleanup completion. The community around him began to change too. Without the old HOA structure, residents formed a voluntary association, transparent, modest, focused on cooperation rather than control. For Quincy, it wasn't victory that lingered, it was peace. He found it in quiet mornings when mist lifted off the lake, in the reflection of sunlight rippling across the surface, and in the silence that no longer carried the tension of fear. But there was one final chapter he hadn't expected. A month after the cleanup ended, a letter arrived. It was from Beatrice Navarro, the woman who had first come forward. She had moved away, leaving the subdivision behind, but her note was short and kind. "You didn't just save the lake," she wrote. "You reminded us that silence is how corruption survives. Thank you for teaching us to question power." He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the binder that had started it all. The once bulging folder of evidence now rested on a shelf in his study, labeled and dated. It wasn't a trophy, it was a record of truth. That evening, he walked to the water's edge. The lake was calm again, the reflection unbroken. A single heron glided low over the surface before disappearing into the trees. He watched until the ripples faded, feeling the kind of quiet his mother once described, a peace that doesn't come from winning, but from knowing you never let lies go unchallenged. The water whispered softly at the shoreline, carrying away the last trace of the storm. The storm that had begun with whispers and warnings ended with headlines and hearings. What had once been a quiet lakeside neighborhood now carried a new reputation, Meadowbrook, the HOA that fell apart. The words appeared in print, on television, and in countless online discussions about property rights, accountability, and greed. For weeks, the town's courthouse became the center of attention. Journalists crowded the steps with cameras, while residents gathered under the shade of old oak trees, waiting to see the woman who had ruled over them for nearly 2 decades finally face justice. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with the scent of paper and polish. Federal prosecutors laid out their case with the precision of a scalpel, methodical, cold, undeniable. Margot Sinclair sat at the defense table in a gray blazer, her once perfect hair streaked with silver, her expression carefully blank. She no longer looked like the woman who had stood at HOA meetings demanding obedience. Now she looked small, cornered, and weary. The prosecution presented evidence from the federal investigation. Bank records, falsified invoices, and chemical purchase orders all linked directly to her. They showed how she and her treasurer, Clayton, had created a fake landscaping company under the name Sweetwater Management LLC, a shell through which they funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars. Each document told the same story: greed disguised as governance. When the environmental data was presented, the courtroom grew silent. The EPA investigator explained how toxic chemicals had been dumped into the lake for years to save disposal costs, poisoning fish and contaminating the water that ran through to Sweetwater Creek. Photos of dead vegetation and oily residue on the surface flashed across the screen. Residents who had once admired Margot now sat with tears in their eyes, realizing what they had unknowingly supported. Quincy attended every day of the trial, sitting quietly near the back. He didn't look for revenge. He looked for truth. Every time evidence appeared that matched the binder he'd assembled months ago, he felt a quiet affirmation, proof that his patience, his precision, and his refusal to be intimidated had mattered. During the third week, Beatrice Navarro testified. She described the intimidation tactics, the fines, the late-night threats, the years of silence. Her voice trembled at first but grew stronger as she spoke. When she stepped down, Margot didn't meet her eyes. Clayton's testimony came next, but his loyalty faltered under pressure. Faced with overwhelming evidence, he accepted a plea deal. In exchange for leniency, he provided details about how the HOA had falsified maintenance records and rerouted funds into private accounts. His confession sealed the case. When the verdict finally came, it arrived without drama. The jury took only 6 hours. Guilty on all major counts: environmental tampering, wire fraud, and misappropriation of community funds. The judge, an older man with a deliberate voice, delivered his sentence with gravity. Margot Sinclair received 9 years in federal prison, a $250,000 fine, and an order to pay restitution to the Meadowbrook resident. Clayton received 5 years and mandatory cooperation in the recovery of misused funds. As the gavel struck, the sound echoed through the chamber like the closing of a long, relentless chapter. In the weeks that followed, Meadowbrook changed. The HOA was officially dissolved, replaced by a voluntary neighborhood committee with full transparency. Financial records were made public, meetings recorded, and residents now voted directly on every major decision. The atmosphere that had once felt heavy with control and fear now carried something lighter: accountability. The lake itself was different too. Federal crews finished the cleanup and replanted native reeds along the bank. The water cleared enough that fish could once again be seen gliding just beneath the surface. Children began playing near the dock again, laughter echoing where silence had once ruled. One afternoon, as Quincy was walking along the shoreline, he met an older man who introduced himself as Robert, one of the longest-standing residents. He had lived under the HOA's thumb for years but had never spoken up. "You changed things here," he said quietly. "We all thought fighting them was impossible." Quincy smiled faintly, shaking his head. "I didn't change anything. I just stopped pretending they couldn't be challenged." The man nodded slowly, watching the sunlight scatter across the water. "That's what makes the difference." A few months later, a local journalist contacted Quincy for an interview. The story of Meadowbrook had spread far beyond their county. Other homeowners from across the state were reaching out, sharing similar stories. Small groups of people standing up to corrupt associations and winning. When the article was published, it carried the headline, "One Homeowner versus the HOA, How One Man's Fight Sparked a Federal Investigation." It went viral overnight. News outlets picked it up, and property rights forums across the country began using the Meadowbrook case as shorthand for community corruption exposed through persistence. Despite the attention, Quincy kept to himself. He still worked his regular surveying job and spent his evenings by the lake, watching the light fade over the trees. Fame was never what he wanted, it was peace. But even peace has echoes. Every now and then, a letter arrived, from strangers who had watched the story unfold online. Some thanked him for inspiring them to challenge their own HOA. Others simply wrote to say they finally felt less alone. He answered each one, his words steady and humble. That autumn, the county held a small ceremony at the courthouse to honor citizens who had contributed to community transparency and environmental preservation. Quincy was invited but hesitated to attend. Beatrice convinced him, saying, "This isn't for you, it's for everyone you gave courage to." When his name was called, he walked to the podium amid quiet applause. The sheriff presented him with a plaque recognizing his dedication to justice and environmental stewardship. As he stood there, he thought about how it all began: a foggy morning, a boundary line, a confrontation at a lake. Every step since had been heavier than he could have imagined, but standing in that room, surrounded by the very people who had once been afraid to speak, he understood something profound. Change doesn't always start with power. Sometimes it starts with one person refusing to look away. After the ceremony, Quincy drove back to the lake. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of evening that hummed with quiet life. Leaves floated across the surface, drifting toward the culvert that had once been the heart of so much trouble. Now it was just water flowing freely, the way it was meant to. He sat at the edge, tracing small ripples with his boot, listening to the soft rush beneath the surface. The lake no longer felt haunted by conflict. It felt honest. The lights from Meadowbrook glowed faintly in the distance, warm and peaceful. Somewhere across the water, someone was playing a guitar on a porch. The sound carried softly through the night, blending with the whisper of the reeds. Quincy took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cold, clean air. It smelled of rain and pine and something else, renewal. The story of Meadowbrook had reached its end, but its message would outlast the scandal. That truth has a way of surfacing, just like the water that refused to stay hidden underground. As he stood to leave, the moon broke through the clouds, its reflection shimmering across the surface of the lake. For the first time in years, he felt completely at peace. The water, once weaponized and poisoned, had returned to what it always was: free. A year had passed since the storm over Meadowbrook finally broke. Seasons turned quietly over the lake, painting it in different moods: soft greens in spring, deep blues in summer, fire-colored reflections in autumn, and a pale stillness in winter. What had once been a site of conflict and corruption had become something else entirely: a place of renewal, of memory, of quiet resilience. Quincy Dalton had stayed. He'd thought, briefly, about selling the property once the investigations ended. The endless visits from reporters, the attention from strangers online, even the curious tourists who came to photograph the famous lake, all of it had weighed on him. But each time he considered leaving, he found himself walking back down to the water, unable to part with it. The lake had been scarred, but it had survived. So had he. The reeds had returned, taller now, vibrant and alive. The water was clean again, alive with ripples where fish broke the surface. Birds nested in the nearby trees, and dragonflies darted like sparks above the waterline. A new dock had been built. Simple, sturdy, handmade by Quincy himself using reclaimed cedar boards. It wasn't just a place to sit. It was a quiet monument to everything the community had endured. From time to time, people came by to visit: families from Meadowbrook, local environmental students, even other homeowners facing HOA battles of their own. They came not for spectacle, but for perspective. Quincy never turned them away. He'd stand on the dock, hands in his pockets, telling them what he'd learned, how the truth took time, how power depended on silence, and how persistence mattered more than rage. He never spoke dramatically, never cast himself as a hero. His words were slow, measured, practical. "Everything leaves a paper trail," he would say. "You just have to follow it long enough to see who's been hiding behind it." By the second spring, the community had changed in ways no one had expected. The old HOA board was gone, and with it went the fear that had once ruled the neighborhood. The residents had voted to form a cooperative, not a governing body but a partnership. Dues were voluntary, expenses public, and every decision was shared openly. Where Margot Sinclair's heavy-handed rules had once dictated every detail, from mailbox color to lawn height, freedom now filled the gap. Yards grew more personal. Gardens bloomed where there had once been uniform grass. Neighbors who barely spoke before now helped one another repaint fences, fix roofs, and clear the overgrown paths around the lake. For the first time in 20 years, Meadowbrook looked like a neighborhood, not a system. And though the scandal had left scars, it had also left lessons. The county used the Meadowbrook case as a training example for other towns, a blueprint of how oversight could fail when authority went unchecked. New laws were passed requiring financial transparency for all homeowner associations in the state. The Meadowbrook Act, as it came to be known, was signed quietly but marked a shift that rippled far beyond their county lines. Quincy's own life had found balance again. He continued his surveying work, but he also began consulting, helping other property owners understand their rights, reading deeds and covenants, and teaching them how to navigate bureaucracy with patience instead of panic. He never advertised, yet people kept finding him. Word of mouth carried his name like a quiet reassurance. "Talk to the lake guy," they'd say. "He knows how to fight back the right way." Each time someone reached out, he'd listen, read their documents, and explain calmly that not every battle needed a war. Sometimes it just needed clarity. At night, after the calls and visits were done, he'd sit at the edge of the dock with a mug of coffee, watching the reflection of the stars ripple across the water. The lake no longer felt like a burden. It was alive, cleansing itself slowly, giving back the peace it had been forced to swallow for years. One late afternoon in early autumn, as the air turned cool and gold leaves began to scatter, a car pulled into his driveway. A woman stepped out, middle-aged, weary, but smiling. It was Beatrice Navarro. He hadn't seen her since the trial. She looked different, lighter somehow, free of the tension that once shadowed her face. She walked down to the dock where he stood and looked out across the water with him. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It's quiet," Quincy replied. Finally. They stood together for a long time, the kind of silence that needs no explanation. Beatrice turned to him. "Do you ever think about her? About Margot?" Quincy hesitated before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Not out of anger anymore. Mostly just wondering how someone convinces themselves that control is the same thing as safety." Beatrice nodded slowly. "That's what power does. It starts small, a rule here, a warning there, until it becomes the only language someone knows." She watched the water for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You gave people a new one." They parted before sunset, the air cooling quickly as she drove away. Quincy stayed behind, sitting on the dock until the sky darkened into violet. The water mirrored the twilight perfectly, smooth, endless, and whole. A few months later, he received an unexpected letter from a law school in the next state over. A professor there wanted to use the Meadowbrook case as a teaching example in an environmental law course, a real-world story of how one person's diligence could reshape community accountability. He gave permission, quietly amused that the lake would now live on in textbooks. And so it did. Students read about the man who traced a culvert, who documented every call, who turned intimidation into evidence. They debated property law, environmental ethics, and the balance between individual rights and collective governance. What had once been a bitter, exhausting chapter of Quincy's life became a story that taught others how to stand their ground. By the third winter, the lake froze over for the first time in years, a thin, silver film stretching from bank to bank. Quincy walked along the shore one morning, listening to the faint creak of ice under the rising sun. Everything around him was still. He thought about how far things had come, the fear, the noise, the endless battles, all distant now, softened by time. What remained was something deeper, proof that truth, once unearthed, couldn't be buried again. He had no need for recognition, no desire for fame. The lake itself was enough, a mirror of endurance, a body of water that refused to be claimed, controlled, or silenced. As he stood there, wind lifting across the frozen surface, he imagined what the future might hold. Children skating here someday, neighbors laughing, a place once cursed by corruption now filled with life again. The water would thaw come spring, carrying with it the faint memory of all it had witnessed. And in that moment, under the pale morning sky, Quincy understood that some legacies aren't written in courts or headlines, they're written in the quiet persistence of ordinary people who simply refuse to be erased. The lake shimmered faintly as sunlight broke through the trees. Its surface was clear. Its story complete.